The cold November rain of 1834 fell steadily across the bluegrass region of Kentucky, turning the roads to mud and the tobacco fields to sodden earth that clung to boots and made every step a struggle. In the slave quarters of Ridgefield Plantation, just outside Lexington, workers gathered in the largest cabin despite the chill, drawn by the presence of a man whose very existence seemed to defy the natural order that governed their lives. According to local legend, this wasn't simply another person trapped in the machinery of Kentucky's peculiar institution. This was someone whose physical presence created a paradox that slaveholders could neither resolve nor safely ignore. A living challenge to the assumptions that made slavery psychologically tolerable for those who practiced it. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 3 years would become a story whispered across the border states. A tale of how fear itself could become a form of power when wielded by someone intelligent enough to recognize it and bold enough to exploit it without ever crossing the line into open rebellion that would justify lethal response. Kentucky in the mid-1830s occupied a complicated position in the geography of American slavery, a border state where the institution existed in forms that differed significantly from the cotton plantations of the Deep South or even the tobacco estates of Virginia and North Carolina. The state's economy depended on a mixture of hemp production, tobacco cultivation, livestock breeding, and increasingly on the domestic slave trade that saw tens of thousands of people sold south and west to feed the insatiable labor demands of the expanding Cotton Kingdom. Lexington had become a major center for this human commerce, with slave markets operating openly in the heart of the city, their operations so normalized that advertisements in local newspapers discussed enslaved people with the same casual language used for horses or farm equipment. The legal structures governing slavery in Kentucky reflected the state's ambiguous position. The slave code was comprehensive and brutal in its denial of rights to enslaved people, yet enforcement was sometimes less rigorous than in states where the enslaved population outnumbered whites and generated constant anxiety about potential uprisings. The society that maintained this system operated through a combination of law, custom, and carefully calibrated violence designed to maintain control, while avoiding the kind of spectacular brutality that might offend the sensibilities of a white population that included significant numbers of small farmers who owned no enslaved people and sometimes questioned the institution's morality, if not its legality. Kentucky slaveholders prided themselves on being more humane than their counterparts in Mississippi or Alabama, pointing to lower rates of family separation and less frequent use of the whip as evidence of their superior moral character. But this self-image obscured a reality that was brutal in its own way. The constant threat of sail south hung over every enslaved person in Kentucky like a sword. The knowledge that any perceived defiance or inadequacy could result in separation from family and transportation to places where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. Into this world of massed violence and systematic exploitation came someone who would expose the gap between slaveholders' self-image and the reality of their power. Someone whose physical presence made the usual mechanisms of control ineffective in ways that terrified those who depended on absolute domination to maintain their economic and social positions. Stories passed down through generations claim that Kojo arrived at Ridgefield Plantation in August 1834, purchased at a Lexington slave market from a Tennessee trader who had acquired him as part of an estate liquidation following the death of a plantation owner near Nashville. The coffle that brought Kojo north had included 15 people, a relatively small group that suggested either a specialized sale or a trader dealing in particularly valuable individuals, rather than the mass movements that characterized the largest commercial operations. But from the moment Kojo stood on the auction block in Lexington's Cheapside Market, where thousands of enslaved people were bought and sold annually, he commanded attention that transcended the routine commercial transactions occurring around him. Standing 7 feet and 6 inches tall, with a physique that suggested both tremendous strength and surprising agility, he literally towered over the auctioneers and potential buyers who circled him with expressions that mixed commercial interest with something approaching unease. His face carried what some observers described as a kind of natural authority, an intelligence in his eyes that seemed to evaluate those evaluating him, creating an unsettling reversal of the power dynamics that auctions were designed to establish and reinforce. Oral histories indicate that Kojo's sale generated unusual controversy among potential buyers, with some planters expressing explicit reluctance to bid despite his obvious physical capabilities. The trader's disclosure that Kojo had been considered difficult to manage in Tennessee, prone to what was carefully described as independent behavior that stopped short of actual defiance but created persistent supervisory challenges, should have reduced his value dramatically in a market that prized docility alongside labor capacity. But his extraordinary size and apparent strength overcame these hesitations for at least one bidder who saw opportunity where others saw risk. The winning offer came from Edmund Carlyle, a planner who had built Ridgefield into one of Lexington's most profitable operations through a combination of inherited wealth, aggressive land acquisition, and a reputation for managing enslaved workers with what he described as firm but fair discipline. Carlyle paid nearly $1,800 for Kojo, a substantial sum that reflected both the giant's potential productivity and the planter's confidence that any management problems could be resolved through proper application of the control mechanisms that had served him well for 2 decades of slaveholding. Carlyle purchased Kojo with intentions that revealed both his commercial instincts and his need to maintain status among Kentucky's slaveholding elite, who measured each other's worth partly through the quality and value of their human property. Beyond the obvious labor value for heavy work in hemp production and tobacco cultivation, Carlyle wanted a symbol of his continued prosperity and power, visible proof that Ridgefield remained among the region's premier plantations, despite increasing competition and economic pressures. He planned to use Kojo for the most demanding physical tasks, while also displaying him to visitors as evidence of the plantation's exceptional character. What Carlyle failed to anticipate, what his confidence in traditional control mechanisms prevented him from recognizing, was that he had purchased someone who combined extraordinary physical presence with strategic intelligence in ways that would render conventional discipline not just ineffective, but actively dangerous to attempt. The rhythm of life at Ridgefield Plantation followed patterns established through decades of Kentucky agriculture, a cycle of intensive labor punctuated by seasonal variations that differed from the year-round demands of Deep South cotton cultivation. Hemp production, which had become increasingly important to Kentucky's economy as demand grew for rope and textiles, required brutal labor from breaking the stalks to processing the fibers, work that destroyed hands and backs through sheer repetitive strain. Tobacco cultivation demanded its own forms of intensive attention, from transplanting seedlings to harvesting and curing leaves in conditions of extreme heat and humidity. Winter brought some relief from field labor, but required workers to perform maintenance tasks, process crops for market, and prepare equipment for the coming growing season. Throughout all of this, discipline was maintained by Carlyle's overseer, a man named Dalton, who had learned his craft on Virginia plantations and brought with him traditional beliefs about the necessity of regular violence to maintain proper order and extract maximum labor from people who had no economic incentive to work beyond avoiding punishment. Kojo worked in these fields and processing facilities like everyone else, initially assigned to hemp production, where his height and strength made him extraordinarily effective at tasks that broke smaller men within seasons. But scattered documents hint that from his earliest days at Ridgefield, his presence created a dynamic that neither Carlyle nor Dalton quite knew how to manage. His extraordinary size made traditional punishment problematic in ways that became apparent when Dalton attempted to establish his authority through the usual methods. The first time the overseer raised a whip to Kojo for some minor infraction, oral histories claim that the giant simply looked down at him with an expression that communicated absolute fearlessness, making no move to resist but also showing no sign of the terror that punishments were designed to instill. Dalton, suddenly aware that he was threatening someone who stood more than a foot taller and possessed the obvious physical capacity to break him like a twig, found himself in an impossible situation. Backing down would destroy his authority, but following through might result in violence that could end with the overseer seriously injured or dead if Kojo chose to defend himself. What happened in that moment, according to local tradition, established a pattern that would define Kojo's entire time at Ridgefield and create ripples that extended far beyond the plantation's boundaries. Dalton lowered the whip without using it, inventing some face-saving excuse about giving Kojo a warning this time, and walked away with his authority fundamentally undermined in ways that everyone present immediately recognized. Word spread through the slave quarters with the speed that information always traveled through communities dependent on knowing where power truly resided versus where it merely claimed to reside. Within days, workers throughout Ridgefield understood that Kojo existed in a different relationship to plantation authority than they did, that the usual mechanisms of control somehow didn't fully apply to someone whose physical presence created fear in those who wielded the whip. This recognition didn't translate into open defiance or dramatic changes in plantation operations, but it created a subtle shift in the psychology of control that would gradually erode Dalton's ability to manage through terror alone. Carlyle, when informed of the incident by his increasingly nervous overseer, faced a dilemma that exposed contradictions at the heart of slavery's operation. The planters' entire economic and social position depended on maintaining absolute authority over the people he claimed to own, yet attempting to enforce that authority against Kojo carried risks that more traditional slaveholding situations didn't present. If Carlyle ordered Dalton to punish Kojo and the giant resisted, the resulting confrontation could end with dead or injured white men, creating legal and social complications that would damage the planter's reputation and possibly result in Kojo's execution, a financial catastrophe given his purchase price. But allowing Kojo to exist outside the normal disciplinary structure would set a precedent that could undermine control over other enslaved workers who might begin to believe that resistance was possible. Some accounts indicate that Carlyle initially decided to wait and observe, hoping that Kojo would settle into routine compliance that would avoid forcing the issue. This decision, born of calculation rather than mercy, effectively conceded that the planter's power had limits that couldn't be publicly acknowledged without destroying the fiction of absolute control that slavery required. The fall of 1834 brought Carlyle's first serious recognition that his purchase of Kojo might have created problems with no good solutions. Challenges that threatened to expose vulnerabilities in the system of control that his entire life had been built upon. Hemp processing season required workers to perform some of the most brutal labor in Kentucky agriculture, breaking dried stalks and separating fibers in conditions that routinely injured hands and generated clouds of dust that damaged lungs. Kojo worked in these operations with an efficiency that should have pleased any profit-minded planter, his size and strength allowing him to process hemp at rates that exceeded normal workers by substantial margins. But his presence in the work gangs created dynamics that Dalton found increasingly difficult to manage. Other workers began positioning themselves near Kojo during the most demanding tasks, as if his presence provided some protection from the overseer's usual harassment and casual violence. When Dalton approached to monitor progress or assign new tasks, he found himself unconsciously avoiding direct confrontation with Kojo, giving orders in tones that suggested request rather than command, moderating his usual aggression in ways that workers noticed and that undermined the performance of absolute authority that effective plantation management supposedly required. Whispered tales speak of Kojo demonstrating during this period an intelligence that went far beyond physical capability, a strategic understanding of psychology and power dynamics that he deployed with remarkable subtlety. He never openly defied orders or refused to work, maintaining a surface level of compliance that gave Carlyle and Dalton no clear justification for the kind of dramatic punishment that might have forced the confrontation everyone wanted to avoid. But within that compliance, he created spaces of autonomy that gradually expanded as overseers proved unwilling to challenge them. When assigned to tasks, he would complete them efficiently, but according to his own judgment about optimal methods, rather than following detailed instructions. When working in groups, he would quietly reorganize labor in ways that reduced strain on smaller workers, redistributing burdens to match people's capabilities rather than following the rigid assignments that Dalton preferred. These adjustments improved overall productivity enough that Carlyle couldn't object without admitting he was more concerned about control than profit. But they also demonstrated that Kojo was making decisions rather than simply following orders, exercising agency in ways that slavery's logic claimed enslaved people didn't possess. By winter of 1835, fragmentary records suggest that word of Kojo's unusual status had spread well beyond Ridgefield, creating conversations among Kentucky's slaveholding class that mixed fascination with anxiety about implications that few wanted to examine too closely. Other planters who visited Carlyle would ask to see the giant, treating him like a curiosity, but watching carefully to observe how he interacted with white authority. Some came away impressed by Kojo's obvious capabilities and speculating about his potential value in their own operations. But others left disturbed by what they had witnessed, by the subtle signs that this enslaved person existed in a relationship to power that differed from what slavery's normal operations assumed. They saw how Dalton's voice changed when addressing Kojo, how the overseer unconsciously stepped back to maintain distance, how other enslaved workers watched these interactions with expressions that suggested they recognized significance that the white men wanted to ignore. Local tradition holds that conversations began circulating among planters about whether owning someone like Kojo represented an asset or a liability, whether his productivity justified the challenge he posed to the psychological foundations of slaveholder authority. Carlyle heard these whispered concerns and found himself trapped between conflicting imperatives that had no obvious resolution. Kojo's labor was genuinely valuable, his productivity in hemp processing and heavy work offsetting his purchase price faster than normal acquisitions would have. But his presence was creating exactly the kind of visible challenge to absolute control that made other slaveholders nervous, raising questions about whether the system's power was as complete as its ideology claimed. The planter considered selling Kojo to eliminate the problem, but doing so would mean admitting the purchase had been a mistake and taking a financial loss that his pride couldn't accept. He considered attempting to break Kojo through systematic punishment that would destroy his spirit and restore proper submission, but the risks of that confrontation were too great and the chances of success too uncertain. So Carlyle found himself in the worst possible position for a slaveholder, maintaining an arrangement that everyone recognized as abnormal, unable to enforce the control he claimed to possess, but unable to acknowledge that inability without destroying his own authority. The spring of 1835 brought an incident that would crystallize the paradox of Kojo's position and demonstrate just how fundamentally his presence challenged the mechanisms that made slavery function. According to oral histories, a new overseer arrived at a neighboring plantation, a man with a reputation for brutal efficiency who had worked on Deep South cotton plantations where management meant breaking people through spectacular violence. This overseer, hearing about Kojo during conversations among white men at a Lexington tavern, made a point of visiting Ridgefield to see the giant who supposedly couldn't be punished. The visitor, whose name appears in some accounts as Crawford, though this may be a generic term for cruel overseers rather than a specific individual, approached Kojo while he worked and began making deliberately provocative comments, clearly intending to generate a response that would justify violence and demonstrate that no enslaved person was truly beyond control. Local tradition holds that what happened next became legendary among enslaved communities throughout Kentucky, a story that captured both the possibilities and the limits of resistance within slavery's brutal constraints. Kojo responded to the provocations not with anger or defiance, but with a kind of patient dignity that was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. He looked down at the overseer from his full 7'6" height and spoke quietly, his words preserved in multiple retellings that suggest they captured something essential about the moment. "You can try to hurt me, but ask yourself if you're willing to die for it. Because one of us might not walk away, and you need to be sure which one that will be before you start something you can't finish." The statement wasn't a threat of violence. It was a cold assessment of reality. An acknowledgement that any physical confrontation between them would be unpredictable in ways that normal plantation discipline never was. The visiting overseer, confronted with this calm evaluation of consequences, backed down without using the whip he had raised, inventing excuses and leaving Ridgefield shortly after, with his own authority undermined before witnesses who would spread word of what they had seen. The consequences of this incident rippled outward through networks of communication that connected enslaved people across plantations and even reached into discussions among white slaveholders who found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about power and control. For enslaved communities, the story of Kojo's confrontation became proof that the master's power had limits, that size and intelligence combined with strategic courage could create spaces of relative safety even within slavery's comprehensive oppression. Workers on other plantations began speaking of Kojo as a kind of hero, someone who demonstrated that resistance didn't always require suicidal rebellion or flight to uncertain freedom, that sometimes simply refusing to be terrorized could itself be a powerful act. These stories took on lives of their own in the telling, attributing to Kojo qualities and actions that might have been elaborations of truth, but served important purposes for communities desperate for examples of successful resistance in whatever forms they could find. For slaveholders, the incident generated anxiety that manifested in increased discussions about whether Kentucky's supposedly more humane form of slavery had become too lenient, whether the state needed to adopt harsher codes like those governing the Deep South to prevent the kind of situation Carlyle had created. Some planters argued that Kojo should be sold south immediately as a matter of maintaining proper social order, that allowing him to continue existing in his anomalous position set dangerous precedents that threatened everyone's security. Others, perhaps more pragmatic, recognized that Kojo's case exposed contradictions inherent in the system itself. Slavery required enslaved people to be strong and capable enough to perform valuable labor, but strength and capability could never be completely controlled if the individual possessing them chose to resist in ways that made the costs of enforcement too high. No amount of legal theorizing about absolute property rights could change the physical reality that someone of Kojo's size could kill an overseer if sufficiently provoked, making prudent slaveholders hesitant to push confrontations to their logical conclusions. By the summer of 1835, scattered documents hint that Carlyle had arrived at an uneasy accommodation with the situation he had created, an informal arrangement that was never explicitly acknowledged but governed daily operations at Ridgefield. Kojo would work efficiently and maintain surface compliance with plantation routines, avoiding open defiance that would force confrontation. In exchange, Dalton and other overseers would avoid attempting to punish him for minor infractions, would moderate their supervision to acknowledge his effective autonomy in managing his own labor, would treat him with a careful respect that was never extended to other enslaved workers. This arrangement violated every principle that slaveholding ideology claimed to uphold. Enslaved people were supposed to be completely subject to their owner's will, with no rights or autonomy that whites were bound to respect. But the alternative was a confrontation that might result in dead white men and destroyed property, outcomes that threatened Carlyle's economic position and social standing more than the quiet erosion of ideological purity. Oral histories claim that Kojo used the space this arrangement created to help other enslaved people at Ridgefield in ways that were subtle enough to avoid provoking response, but significant enough to materially improve lives lived under systematic oppression. When Dalton wasn't watching, he would take on additional work to reduce burdens on older workers or those recovering from illness, using his extraordinary strength to accomplish tasks that would have required multiple people working to exhaustion. He became a kind of informal arbiter of disputes among enslaved workers, using his unique position to mediate conflicts before they escalated in ways that would draw overseer attention and punishment. He shared food from his own rations with children and families that were struggling, redistributing resources in small acts of mutual aid that slavery's economics claimed shouldn't exist. None of these actions were dramatic enough to appear in any plantation records, but they created networks of obligation and respect that transformed Kojo from isolated individual into a kind of community leader whose influence extended far beyond his physical capabilities. The fall of 1835 brought unexpected developments that demonstrated just how widely Kojo's reputation had spread and how uncomfortable it made Kentucky's slaveholding elite. According to some accounts, a group of abolitionists based in Ohio made contact with people at Ridgefield, offering to help Kojo escape to freedom in Canada, where British law would protect him from recapture. Whether this offer was genuine or was actually a trap set by slave catchers trying to identify resistance networks remains unclear in historical record and oral tradition. What seems certain is that Kojo declined the offer, choosing to remain at Ridgefield rather than flee to uncertain freedom. His reasons, as preserved in stories passed down through generations, reflected sophisticated understanding of both his own situation and his responsibilities to the community that had formed around him. He reportedly said that running would mean abandoning people who depended on him, that his presence at Ridgefield provided protection and assistance that would disappear if he left, that sometimes the most important resistance was staying and making life more bearable for others, rather than saving yourself through flight. This decision, if the stories about it are accurate, reveals dimensions of Kojo's character and strategic thinking that complicate simple narratives about slavery and resistance. The dominant culture's stories about enslavement emphasize dramatic escapes and violent rebellions as the only authentic forms of resistance, implicitly devaluing the countless small acts of defiance and mutual aid that made daily survival possible under systematic oppression. But Kojo's choice to remain, to use his unusual position to protect and assist others rather than pursuing individual freedom, demonstrates a form of resistance that was no less courageous for being less visible to those outside enslaved communities. It suggests that he understood his responsibility was not just to himself, but to the broader community, that his physical presence and the fear it generated in overseers created space that could benefit many people rather than just one individual fleeing to freedom. By 1836, fragmentary records suggest that Ridgefield had developed a peculiar reputation among Kentucky plantations, known both for its productivity and for operating according to rules that differed subtly from normal plantation discipline. Carlyle continued to profit from Kojo's labor while avoiding the confrontations that would force acknowledgement of the limits of his control. Dalton continued to supervise operations while carefully avoiding situations that would expose his inability to punish the plantation's most valuable worker. Other enslaved people at Ridgefield continued to work under the usual brutal conditions of slavery, but with small ameliorations that Kojo's presence made possible. Slightly lighter workloads when he could redistribute tasks, slightly less frequent beatings when his physical proximity made overseers hesitant to indulge their usual cruelty. Slightly more hope that absolute powerlessness wasn't actually absolute if someone as extraordinary as Kojo could create spaces of relative safety. Local tradition holds that this uneasy equilibrium persisted until early 1837, when Kojo simply disappeared one night without warning or explanation, vanishing as completely as someone his size could possibly vanish from a region where his presence had been widely known. Whether he finally accepted help escaping to freedom, whether he was secretly sold away by Carlyle, who wanted to eliminate the problem without admitting it publicly, whether he fled on his own using knowledge of the region gained through years of observation, all of these possibilities exist in different versions of the story, none confirmed by documentary evidence that might have survived. What seems certain is that his disappearance generated significant controversy in Lexington and throughout Kentucky's bluegrass region, with Carlyle offering rewards for information while also seeming strangely reluctant to pursue investigation too aggressively, as if the planter was relieved to have the problem resolved even if it meant financial loss. The impact of Kojo's time at Ridgefield persisted long after his physical departure, rippling through enslaved communities and slaveholder conversations in ways that shaped both resistance and control in Kentucky for years afterward. For enslaved people, the story of the giant who couldn't be punished became a legend that spread across the border states and beyond, proof that the master's power had limits that could be exposed by someone with the right combination of physical presence, intelligence, and strategic courage. Workers on plantations throughout Kentucky whispered about Kojo, using his example to imagine possibilities for resistance that didn't require suicidal confrontation or desperate flight. The story took on mythical dimensions in some tellings, attributing to him feats of strength and acts of defiance that might have been elaborations, but served essential purposes for communities desperate for heroes who had successfully challenged the system's power. For slaveholders, Kojo's legacy was more troubling and generated conversations that revealed deep anxieties about the stability of the entire system. Some planters argued that his case demonstrated the dangers of allowing enslaved people to become too valuable or too physically imposing, that prudent management required keeping workers interchangeable and individually powerless. Others recognized that Kojo had exposed contradictions inherent in slavery itself. The system depended on enslaved people possessing capabilities that could never be completely controlled if the individual chose to resist in ways that made enforcement costs too high. A few in private conversations that wouldn't be committed to written records even admitted that perhaps absolute control was impossible, despite legal fictions claiming otherwise. That the appearance of total domination masked negotiations and accommodations that slavery's ideology denied, but practical operations required. The deeper truth that Kojo's story illuminates extends far beyond the specific circumstances of one extraordinary individual at a single Kentucky plantation. His experience reveals fundamental contradictions that made slavery inherently unstable, despite the massive apparatus of law and violence deployed to maintain it. The system required enslaved people to possess strength and intelligence sufficient to perform valuable labor, but those very qualities created potential for resistance that no amount of brutality could completely suppress. It required maintaining absolute control through fear of punishment, but fear worked only when overseers were willing and able to follow through on threats, something that became problematic when the threatened individual possessed the physical capacity to make punishment dangerous for those administering it. Slavery depended on reducing human beings to property that could be completely dominated, but human beings could never be reduced to mere objects no matter what legal theories claimed, and some individuals possessed qualities that made the gap between ideology and reality impossible to ignore. Kojo's extraordinary size made these contradictions visible in ways that normal-sized enslaved people's resistance might not have. His 7'6" height meant he couldn't be overlooked or rendered invisible in the ways that slavery preferred, couldn't be reduced to the anonymous units of labor that plantation economics assumed. His physical presence forced recognition of his individuality and capabilities, created situations where the usual mechanisms of control revealed their limitations, generated fear in overseers who understood that violence against him carried risks that routine punishment of smaller people didn't present. The strategic intelligence he brought to navigating his situation transformed these physical advantages into a form of power that operated within slavery's brutal constraints while challenging its fundamental assumptions about absolute domination and complete powerlessness. Stories passed down through generations preserve knowledge about resistance that official documents systematically excluded. Knowledge about how enslaved people created spaces of relative autonomy even within comprehensive oppression. How they built communities of mutual support despite systematic attempts to prevent such organization. How they maintained dignity and agency even when law and custom denied both. These oral traditions tell us that resistance took countless forms beyond the dramatic rebellions and escapes that dominate historical narratives. That sometimes the most important acts were quiet refusals to be completely broken, small redistributions of resources to help those struggling, strategic uses of whatever advantages circumstances provided to protect community members from the worst violence. They remind us that behind every statistic about plantation productivity, every ledger entry recording enslaved people as property, stood individuals with their own intelligence and moral agency, who made choices about how to survive and resist within the limited options their circumstances allowed. The fact that we cannot verify every detail of Kojo's story with documentary precision does not diminish its essential truth or its importance for understanding slavery and resistance. The story carries the weight of lived experience transmitted through communities that understood the dangers of certain kinds of visibility, while recognizing that complete invisibility meant complete erasure from historical memory. It speaks to the creative intelligence that enslaved people brought to the fundamental problem of maintaining humanity in a system designed to destroy it, to the countless ways they found to resist even when direct confrontation meant death. The fragmentary nature of the historical record itself tells a story about how power works to preserve narratives that serve its interests while erasing evidence of its failures and limitations. Slaveholders kept meticulous records of property transactions and crop yields, but rarely documented moments when their authority was successfully challenged, or when enslaved people demonstrated capabilities that contradicted racist ideology justifying their enslavement. The legacy of Kojo and others like him resonates across American history, because it reminds us that slavery was never the stable, efficiently brutal system its architects claimed. It was always contested, always resisted, always undermined by the very people it sought to reduce to things. Every assertion of absolute power revealed its own limitations to those paying attention. Every attempt to maximize control created new vulnerabilities. Every claim of complete domination masked negotiations and accommodations that practical reality required, even as ideology denied their existence. The enslaved people of Kentucky and throughout the United States maintained their humanity through countless acts of resistance, both large and small, preserved memories and traditions that contradicted official narratives, created communities of mutual support that sustained people through unimaginable hardship and made survival possible when the system seemed designed to make it impossible. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities kept alive when official history tried to erase them, that resistance and dignity stood 7 feet 6 inches tall, generating fear in those who claimed absolute power, creating spaces of relative safety for others through strategic deployment of physical presence combined with intelligence, demonstrating that even the most comprehensive systems of oppression contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with the vision to see them and the courage to act. Kojo's presence at Ridgefield lasted only about 3 years, but his impact rippled through enslaved communities across generations, creating stories that inspired others to recognize that the master's power was never as absolute as they claimed. That resistance was possible in forms beyond suicidal rebellion, that human dignity could survive and even flourish in spaces carved out through strategic courage and mutual support. The truth of these stories lies not in their precise factual accuracy, but in the experiences they represent and the knowledge they preserve. Knowledge about how people maintained agency under comprehensive oppression, about how they created meaning in circumstances designed to render life meaningless, about how they kept alive the dream of freedom even when its achievement seemed impossibly distant.